What's up, everybody? Peter X is So Coffee here, and welcome to another episode of All Things Music. And today I'm doing, we're looking at, music history and jazz and its impact on popular music. So I've said this before, but, before the mid 50s when rock and roll came along, jazz was the musical king. And there's a lot of interplay between jazz and blues. The blues did precede jazz. So jazz comes out of New Orleans in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And probably, the New Orleans airport, I lived in New Orleans for 3 years in the late 80s, but New Orleans Airport is called Louis Armstrong Airport. So, guess who they believe, is the most important jazz figure early on, Louis Armstrong. What makes jazz special? Well, it's the relationship with time and swing. No jazz, you don't have funk, you really, you don't have, without R&B, it's the rhythm that became important. It's probably jazz's, it's probably jazz's big contribution to popular music today is rhythm. Melody and the harmony and that stuff, and the hooks that really comes out of in my opinion. You can go listen to my episode All Things Music on it, but that comes out of doo-wop. And then blues is the that brings the mood and the emotion. So the first great thing jazz brings is swing, rhythm, and time. The second is spontaneity and improvisation. So that was those elements existed in blues to some extent, but it's really jazz that really brings that. And I've always said that Robert Johnson and early blues and country is very little difference, but when the blues men brought in and women brought in jazz, and that's where the improvisation and the B.B. Kings and the great guitar players and the great pianists and piano players and blues come alive. So that's that spontaneity and improvisation. And then group interaction. That's the third most really important thing jazz brings. And this probably, I'm just riffing off the top of my head now, not even going on notes, but this group interaction is between instruments. Sometimes they're conversing and whatnot. You listen to the particularly that great Miles Davis stuff from the the late Cooking with Miles and all that from the late 50s, Miles and Miles and Coltrane talking with their horns. So that group interaction, but then it goes from the instruments to human interaction when doo-wop, because doo-wop is all about the interaction of the members of the group. So it's interesting how it starts in one place and other genres pick it up and do different things, and it keeps going into what we know today. Number four, the important thing that makes jazz special is developing an individual unique voice. So your own playing style, and of course this is vitally important, when it comes to classic rock, and particularly with the guitarists. Because most of them really worked hard to find their own unique tone and playing style, and that all comes out of jazz. And of course, the greatest jazz guitarist of all time is Jimi Marshall Hendrix. So Um, quick run through, jazz history. So we start with big band and dance, and yeah, I mean that's interestingly enough, those a lot of those riffs from the big band era, thinking Benny Goodman and oh boy, some of the, but we had some really major, black Lionel Hampton, I believe. Well, we had so Benny Goodman was the big one. If you're Gen X the kid, you'll remember Lawrence Welk. I mean, that was still big band, even in the late '60s, early '70s. But yeah, big band, and they danced to it. Malcolm X talks about the Lindy Hop when he was, a teenager in his young 20s, and all that stuff. So yeah, the big band, and that, though a lot of those very similar horns arrangements come back. Not everybody, James Brown had a very different way of using his horns in the late '60s and early '70s funk. But the use of horns, in funk in the '70s is very similar to the band era. And so after the big band comes bebop. This is the mid to late '40s. So they, bebop, tries to make the music more challenging. To be honest, the Pat Boone phenomenon we find out in the '50s, with white artists stealing the blues artist and the black blues artists not getting paid for the covers. That was going on, in the big band area, and taking black compositions and and in the eyes of uh, the black jazz musicians, watering it down and making a lot more money. So you know Miles Davis said, all right, I'm going to make some stuff that's really hard and that can't be copied. So so bebop kind of becomes literary fiction. If you ever read it's not an easy read, and it's very artsy and non-accessible for a lot of people. It's for quote unquote smart people. So after that, in the late '40s, cool jazz comes on, calmer, smoother sound. Bebop did the tempo, bebop took the tempo up, and hard bop comes in the mid '50s, and it's bringing in R&B and gospel and blues. I don't know if, and then modal jazz comes in, where it becomes a little more experimental. Start playing around with different chord structures and fewer chords, and a little more experimental. And modal jazz is that's in the early, the late '50s. And you have free jazz, which is very unstructured in the late '50s going into the '60s. And then fusion, which is one of my favorite genres. That's, Miles Davis, the late '60s going into the '70s, maybe Weather Report also is a fusion. And then you get smooth jazz. They say the early '80s, but by the late '70s, you got Grover Washington, and Chuck Mangione and those folks, doing smooth jazz. And, smooth jazz is still doing very good for itself today. So, we talked earlier about the different, what made jazz unique was the improvisation. So classical music was, you play the composition as was written. So there's a very much fidelity to the music and the score. And the jazz was totally the opposite. It was the interaction and collaboration of the musicians in the group. That was the most important aspect of it, and then playing off each other and kind of riffing off each other. And, of course, it was, you were expected to kind of do your own thing, and no two performances were alike, and so that's really kind of what makes jazz unique. So here we go. Let's go back. Catching up on my notes here. So, in the big band era, you got Benny Goodman and Jimmy and Tommy Dorsey and Glenn Miller. So those were the white big band leaders, and the black ones, you had Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Lionel Hampton, Count Basie, and then Cab Calloway. I don't know. Cab was a singer. He was probably the Michael Jackson of the era. I mean, if you go back and you look at some, on YouTube and put in Cab Calloway, Cab had some dance moves too. He really was the first to probably bring in call and response that we see a lot of times. Everybody using it, think, Prince used it a lot, think Kiss Alive and I Want You, and the call and response that, Paul Stanley does, with the crowd out there. Cab Calloway was doing that, way back in the 30s and 40s. Then, of course, Charlie Christian, one of the few jazz folks in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He basically invented the electric guitar tone. He was a young African-American who died way too soon, but Benny Goodman gave him his big break. And, before that, people were like, guitar, that you can't do big band because, the acoustic guitar couldn't cut through the big band. Well, the electric guitar could. So Charlie Christian, creates that tone. And so, then the 50s, you had Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald and Sarah Vaughan, the great female vocalists. And as far as the great African-American jazz folks, Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, Max Roach, Bud Powell, Miles Davis. And then on the other side, you get, the white jazz artists. Said this before, Frank Sinatra is a jazz singer, and he was, before Elvis, there was Frank, and then you got Stan Getz and Dave Brubeck. So just following my notes here. So, again, I don't know. Hold on. So I did do my citations, and I'll hit these at the end for as far as it goes on YouTube. But going back to bebop, Charlie Parker and Miles were big in bebop. I mentioned Miles before. He said, let's do bebop. Let's make music they can't steal and profit from. So, but why bebop is so important? It kind of leads to the downfall of jazz and the rise of rock and roll, because, jazz becomes less accessible. And it's interesting that, you could argue the same thing now has happened to rock and roll. These new metal bands aren't trying, Mudvayne and Slipknot, they're not trying to, go number one, on the Billboard Hot 100 singles chart. And so, in many ways, for whatever reason, but that's kind of how bebop was. And bebop was, for a select few. And, most people think jazz today is elitist, and bebop was the start of that elitism, but it's important for other things. It was a faster tempo. It was no longer focused on dance. The ride cymbal kept time. And here's where it gets really important, though. The snare and the bass drum were used to create accents or syncopation. Now, if you listen to anything on my funk channel, or you're a funk fan and you listen to funk musicians talk about funk, syncopation is, incredibly important to funk. And so James Brown is, credited for creating funk along with Sly Stone. But the first song on the one was a late '50s song. I don't have it in front of me, from Ray Charles, but "Hit the Road Jack" from 1961. That Ray Charles hit was on the one. So Ray, and they took the word funk was thrown around in jazz circles in the black community in the '50s. So, and James, I mean, the JBs were funk artists. They rolled with James because James paid better than jazz gigs. So, so bebop is very important in the rise of funk. Um, Bebop also used more complex chord structures than the big band era did. Um, and you bring in tension through dissonance. So dissonance is consonance in music is complementary sounds, and dissonance is taking uh, clashing sounds and make them creating that tension. And the same way psychedelic Public Enemy was good at it, the Doors, Jimi Hendrix, and Fusion. And then, of course, I mentioned smooth jazz. I talked about Grover Washington Jr. and Mr. Magic was his big one. But David Sanborn, Najee, and Kenny G. And I mentioned Chuck Mangione earlier. So I mean, smooth jazz is sort of the bigger thing now commercially, and it's been that way, from the '80s until today. But I mean, these young folks are really, really up in the game. I mean, I don't know if they're making any money doing it, but you don't go into jazz to make money. But you know, um, go on Spotify, the State of Jazz, and listen to what's going on there. I mean, millennials and Gen Z are doing it up in jazz. It's very interesting what's going on. I mean, they're taking really electronic sounds and mixing it up with very acoustic sounds, and it's just a lot of really innovative and cool stuff. So my favorites, I mean, obviously Davis, John Coltrane, but I'm a big Cannonball Adderley fan, Dexter Gordon, Sonny Rollins, Herbie Hancock, and Sarah Vaughan is my female vocalist. So yeah. So yeah, that's a kind of the history of jazz. Going to talk about three individuals who, in jazz, who are. I mean, you can't talk about popular music today without talking about these three. And that's Ray Charles, Quincy Jones, and Quincy just passed in 2024, and Miles Davis. I know Miles is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I don't think Quincy is yet. I'm not sure about Ray. Ray should be, because I said this earlier, when I did my doo-wop episode. Ray Charles is probably the most important musician in popular music, because he was the first to meld stuff. Um, he was an amazing piano player. So he was a jazz piano player who sang gospel, who understood gospel, and who understood the blues. And so between jazz and blues and gospel, he he melded them all together. So he was the first to kind of create his own stew like that. Um, and and I think Ray Charles and doo wop are kind of the bridge between Frank Sinatra and Elvis. Ray actually. And then and then I forgot. I mean, Ray's other big thing was he was in the country music, and in the late '60s and early '70s. I mean, he had huge country albums. So he took four. I mean, he took gospel, jazz, blues, and country, and melded them together into its own. He was the first to really go out and do that in a big way. Um, So Ray was born in the South. He moves to Seattle. Here's where it gets interesting. History gets really interesting, and meets up with a really young guy named Quincy Jones. And Quincy, we know him more as a producer later on in his career, but he was also a trumpet player and a very good one. So Ray, Quincy is a very, very interesting background, and I think you have, why he's important. Let me read off some names here who he worked with: Count Basie, Frank Sinatra, Michael Jackson, Dizzy Gillespie. He played trumpet for Elvis in the 50s when Elvis did the TV shows. Elvis's first six appearances, Ray was playing or Quincy was playing the trumpet for him. That's amazing right there. And of course he produced Off the Wall, Thriller, and Bad for Michael Jackson. So those are three of the best-selling albums of all time. 1953, Quincy Jones travels in Lionel Hampton's band. So he's in the big band era. He also was an arranger conductor for the Rat Pack, meaning Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr. Quincy also did his own music. Now, look at this list. He produced albums for the following: Billy Preston, Little Richard, Donny Hathaway, Aretha Franklin, Frank Sinatra, Ray Charles, Donna Summer, the Winans, the Brothers Johnson, Funk Dudes, George Benson, Jazz, Louis Armstrong, Count Basie, Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, Dinah Washington. Again, let me repeat: Frank Sinatra, Aretha Franklin, those two. Little Richard. So, he was, and then Michael Jackson. So, and then, played with Elvis. So, Quincy's DNA is all over music history. And then the one and only Miles Davis. So he started off, he broke through in the mid 40s, playing in Charlie Parker Bird's band, playing bebop, and then he did cool jazz, and then he did hard bop, and he kind of blew up his catalog both times to do that, and then he had just these amazing albums, from the late 50s, through the 60s. So 1959, Kind of Blue. 1960, Sketches of Spain. 1970, Bitches Brew, Fusion, which brought in the whole fusion movement. Then 75, he did Pangea and Agartha. And then he does, in the 80s, he starts doing, funk, and then he brings in, hip hop, posthumously, but, with Doo-Bop, the album in 1992, where, they're, hip hop beats and rapping, but his whole 80s, catalog, in 90s, The Man with the Horn, You're Under Arrest, Tutu, Amanla, all that stuff in the 80s was in the funk. So he just, he jumped from genre to genre, and early on he blew up his catalog and created new genres. So he's, cool jazz, he's basically credited for creating that, and, hard bop, at the forefront. I don't know if he, actually created that, but he certainly, fusion, he certainly created that as well. He, maybe some folks in the fringes were doing fusion before, maybe it's, but when Bitches Brew dropped, that's when, fusion got big. Did the Beatles create, psychedelic music with Sgt. Pepper? No, but they elevated it. So the next with Miles Davis, of course, is his band members: John Coltrane, Herbie Hancock, Sonny Rollins, Chick Corea, James Ntume, who, was big in R&B in the 80s with his ballads and his funk, Wayne Shorter, Charlie Mingus, and Cannonball Adderley. Those I mean, that's a whole era of jazz, and they all went through Miles. So yeah, and a lot of music scholars have said this before about jazz. I mean, with the slavery and Jim Crow and all the oppression of African American people and the freedom embodied in jazz and the improvisation, I mean, it only made sense that it would come out of, the black community. And jazz has a lot of paradoxes and um, uh, yeah, paradoxes. That's the word I'm looking for, and that come out a lot. I mean, it can be very emotional, but hard to put into words. And jazz can be rational, and it can be irrational, particularly when you get into free jazz. And it's just that tension that particularly coming from the black jazz players that really makes it interesting, to listen to. So one of the other interesting things with jazz, so a lot of the records were made in Chicago. Just like Chicago was you know, and Memphis for blues, but Chicago was big for the recording of the jazz albums. But New York City was where the big concert venues or the clubs were at. So, and that's where Miles spent most of his life, was in New York City playing the clubs. And obviously they had record companies in New York City too, because the draw, to play live by the great jazz players. Um, yeah. And finally, jazz is brings in elements from African music and classical music out of Europe. So, I mean, the African is again the emphasis on the rhythm, and out of Europe they you bring these the common themes to to bring the music together, because even though jazz doesn't seem, it seems formless, and it is, if it's free jazz, there is a structure there. There's usually, you know, choruses and bridges and some repetition of different parts of the song, just like you would hear in a pop song. But also, the African of letting each musician and listener experience their own musical journey. That comes out of Africa, but is certainly enhanced in jazz. And ragtime, is sort of the the thing that binds the blues and jazz together, because I mean, was ragtime had comes out of the blues and has jazz elements, and then jazz comes out of ragtime, and ragtime is the more piano based of the blues, and so that's kind of the bridge there between ragtime, between the blues and jazz. And we can't forget the connection between jazz and prohibition. I mean, jazz was the music of prohibition, and you see those old Capone movies or the mob, speakeasies, and black jazz artists were always playing them. Yeah. And finally, so this is a good um, going back and looking, historically. So the slave work songs that came out of blues weren't written down. They couldn't be read, or, so they were improvised. And so that's where the improvisation comes out of it, are these work songs. So the emotional aspect, leads into the blues, and the improvisational aspect, because unlike classical music, most of the slaves couldn't write much less, did they know notes or anything else. And so that improvisational aspect, comes out in these work songs. And each person was given a voice, and so that whole, finding your own voice and finding your unique voice, that becomes so important, and jazz comes out of the work songs as well. So yes, it's fascinating history, and then the interplay and weaving between jazz and blues. So let me give you my end with my kind of uh, my YouTube. I love these YouTube documentaries. So jazz, its impact on popular music. That was one documentary. Yeah, the wrestling, the papers, my notes. Um, the history of jazz. That's another YouTube documentary. A brief history of jazz. Again, another YouTube documentary. The history of jazz, part 1. And jazz rhythms of freedom. So that's kind of the stuff that I watch to get improvisation, or get some get a shell of the information, and the whole stuff on Quincy Jones and Miles Davis and Ray Charles. I kind of wing that because those three are so important to just the development of music in general. You don't have the Beatles or Prince or Ye, these rule breakers without Miles Davis, because he was the first rule breaker, and he was the one who really pushed boundaries and wasn't afraid to blow up his older music catalog, and that's why the Beatles are so beloved. Prince is the same way. Yeah, I'm trying to think of some of these other, trailblazers. In some ways, Queen. I mean, Queen, when it comes to rock in the 70s, they were kind of the Beatles of the 70s, and did some experimental stuff, or dabbled in a lot of different stuff. I mean, the Beastie Boys. So I'm just, in that vein. On this slide, I mean, Beyonce gets, she's more experimental than people think. Drake can get experimental at times, even though, everybody focuses on, all the charts, and how he's ruled the charts for a while. But, he'll sprinkle some EDM in there and stuff like that. And he has, his own unique song structures that he does with things. I cover in my episode of Drake and songwriting. So, yeah, anyway, this was fun. I had to do this, as far as, I mean, it is music appreciation. You can't really cover this without doing jazz. So it's been you just, you soak it in and do the journey, and it just kind of, when jazz is ready to speak through me, it spoke. So, yeah, so let me hit this close. I have 6 albums of my own now. I record under the name Exodus, Exodus. My first album is called Book 1. I also write science fiction, fantasy, novels. I have 2 novels and a novella on Amazon, and I write under the name Peter Exodus O'Coffer. So thank you for coming through, and I will see you next episode.